Good evening. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm privileged to welcome you to this evening's webinar on behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security and Massachusetts Peace Action. Let me begin by saying that the title for this evening's webinar was not chosen lightly. When I was young, just after World War II and the Nazi genocide, Reverend Martin Niemöller's name was the one German name that could be spoken with a sense of respect in our home. After the Vietnam War, I was privileged to meet and to work with him. Now, as our government is increasingly racist, Pluto and kleptocratic, authoritarian, and old-fashioned imperial, we should make Pastor Niemöller's courage our own as we work for justice, peace, and respect for human dignity. As in Reverend Niemöller's warning that first they came for the communists, today in the United States we are all under attack. First, they are coming for the most vulnerable, immigrants, people of color, and sexual minorities. But our universities, freedom of thought and assembly, the press, and all of our democratic rights and institutions are under attack. We've been told that only criminal immigrants are being detained and deported. That is far from the truth. Last month, more people were arrested by immigration authorities than in any month in the previous 7 years, and DHS jails were filled to capacity with 47,600 people incarcerated as immigrant detainees, and the conditions, as you can read there, are horrible. In communities across the country, including here in Massachusetts, law-abiding immigrants who play leading roles in their communities are being detained and held for deportation. The Pentagon is being mobilized to play leading roles in the deportations, including transformation of massive U.S. Army bases in Texas into concentration camps near the Mexican border. More than 100 immigrants were moved into and out of Guantanamo, where some were held in more dehumanizing conditions than the accused 9/11 terrorists. U.S. citizens, European terrorists, and even a Canadian television star have been rounded up and imprisoned. Fears abound among many immigrants. The arrest and threatened deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, a green card holder and former student at Columbia University, and the violation of a court order in deporting several hundred Venezuelan and Salvadoran immigrants this past weekend signals that the Constitution and all of our human rights are under attack. As they said during the Spanish Civil War, no pasaran. Tonight, we have the privilege of meeting and learning from three wise and courageous organizers for immigrant rights. Itzel Hernandez is an immigrant rights organizer with the American Friends Service Committee in Red Bank, New Jersey, and a DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals recipient. She focuses on tracking policy and registration issues. Araceli Argueta is the AFSC's campaigner from El Salvador. She's in New Jersey leading the organizing. She's the Organizing and Advocacy Director for AFSC in New Jersey, Immigrant Rights Program. She is an organizer, anthropologist, and People's Power campaigner, originally from El Salvador. She has worked as an organizer with AFSC on both sides of the border in Mexico with women, youth, and indigenous people, including many who have been incarcerated here. Dr. Alexandra Pineros Shields, originally from Colombia, is associate professor and director of the Master of Public Policy program at Brandeis University's Heller School. Rooted in liberation theology, she has worked for immigrant rights, including legal services, community organizing, and as director of the Essex County Community Organization for the better part of several decades, we'll put it that way. I should stress that the actions being presented in this evening do not include civil disobedience, even though many of us have engaged in such morally driven actions in the past. That said, if the Trump MAGA government continues to refuse to honor court orders, we may find ourselves beginning to think in terms of general strikes to uphold the rule of law. Then about the format. Itzel, Araceli, and Alexandra will each speak for about 10 minutes and in that order. We'll give them a few more minutes to ask one another questions and to push back on against one another if they wish on their presentations. Then we'll turn to your questions and answers. If you want to pose a question, please submit it as concisely as possible via the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen. As this evening's MC, I want to ask you to refrain from entering comments or engage in debates there, as that will make it much more difficult for me to identify and ask your important questions. So with that, Itzel, the floor is yours.
Gonna actually kick it over to Araceli.
Yeah, we make a switch there. So Mariana, could you help us out with the, yes, thank you. So thank you everyone for being here. As Joseph said, I'm Araceli Argueta. I do a lot of my work based on New Jersey, working on detention communities and people that it's facing detention and deportation. So my presentation will be focused on the immigration detention industrial complex. And I want to start doing a reflection on the next slide, especially on violence and why it is important to understand the narratives around violence and around immigration that are shaping the way that we understand and legitimize harm, and that it's being used against communities right now. So the first thing that I want to say is that right now the narrative of the current administration is framing that certain lives are expendable, and it's using symbolic representation and narratives in speech to reproduce harm into the people, and that violence have stripped out people of their dignity, and that they are doing it to justify the destruction of nature, for instance, at some point with the idea of progress, or they justify the genocide in Gaza under the label of self-defense, but they are now justifying the criminalization of communities under the label of security, or the separation and incarceration of families under the label of border security and invasion. In most of the cases, this is fake news, and this is information that is being handled in order to criminalize communities. We could go to the next one. So over the presentation, I will touch for really important things. I will go a little bit on new executive orders, but only two involving detention. Itself will focus a little bit more on some of the others. I will talk about the due process and how it is impacting communities that are facing detention, the for-profit detention facilities, and how they are using immigrant communities for profiting around, and what is happening with the detention facilities outside the United States. We can go to the next one. First, the industrial complex for detention combines prisons, combines different spaces that detain immigrants, including military complexes, and now including facilities around the world. So the government outsource different immigrations and private facilities so they can provide the services that, as they call them, for detention. They justify this on ideas of war for terror, war for drug, or border enforcement, which is only criminalization in a way of human trafficking. What they are doing is they are incarcerating people, send them from one place to the other, and making really difficult for communities to find their relatives or to find where people is being transferred. Also making really difficult for attorneys to do the process with them and support their defense. Some of the companies that are involved in this are, the biggest one are Geo Group and CoreCivic, and I will talk a little bit more about them later on the presentation. So we can continue to the next one. So some of the executive orders, and the one that have been used for most of the detention, is the Protecting American People Against Invasion. And this executive order, what it does is that it expands the expedited removal, meaning that people will be deported faster than usual, without access to an attorney, without access to legal counseling. And in some cases, we have seen that people is thrown at the border, especially at Nogales area, and people is thrown there just to cross the border, or people is being transferred, as I mentioned before, to different places. So this also gives the Department of Homeland Security the ability to deport someone without designating a court appearance, or without any sort of legal advice, including when people doesn't have any criminal or civil lawsuits against them. They also authorize that the government can lawsuit against sanctuary cities, including the ones that are defining laws that protect or prevent that local law enforcement cooperate with the detention, with ICE, and with DHS officials. We can go to the other one. And the most recent one, the Alien Enemies Act that Joseph mentioned at the beginning. This is a really old legislation from the 1700s. And it was used during the war. It has been used for 3 times, all of them during a wartime. And the idea of the Trump administration is use this law to pursue mass deportations across the country. They are arguing, as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea once again of that there is an invasion happening, and that idea of the invasion is being used to justify the application of this act. So the act, let's go to the next one. The act received a process from a judge that it was canceled, the flight that they were being sent to El Salvador. And I will show you a little bit of the reactions afterwards. But before, I wanted to touch a little bit upon the due process, which is the process of actually providing rights to immigrant communities and having the access to legal counseling and legal rights, and that those rights are respected. But what we have seen in most of the cases is that those rights are not being upheld, and that people inside the system is facing threats, and it's facing even firstly to sign their auto deportation, like their own deportation. People is being forced with threat, with speech, like without having the capacity to defend themselves, to be self-deported. One of the things that we used to have, because the immigration system has been always very complicated, and then in the past, only 4% of people who represent themselves was able to get out of detention. Now, with this new ruling, it has been really difficult for legal representatives, legal services, to provide representation to people that it's facing detention to the amount that right now we are getting calls, and we have to turn like to counseling instead of all the representation that we could do, because we are at capacity for the representation. And then representation becomes an impossibility for people, and they have to face in court, when they have the access to court, to really train ICE representatives that they don't even have the opportunity to have a computer or to have access to prepare themselves for defending their case. And they have to face someone that has been for a long time prepared to represent or to go against immigrant communities. So it becomes heavier for communities and for organizing to support each other. Let's go to the next one. And then we have the for-profit facilities, and this is just awful, the way that they operate. Like, the 2 biggest companies that operate in the United States are the Geo Group and the CoreCivic. They are for-profit companies, and they pretty much treat communities as money bags that they are throwing from one side to the other. They have detention facilities all over the country, and over the past year have earned billions of dollars in ICE contracts. Even when this administration was announced, both of the CEOs of the companies made conference saying that it was going to be a really fruitful period for them, knowing that the increase of detention facilities and the increase of detention and deportation of the communities was going to increase their profits. Both of the companies have a long history of mistreatment of people facing detention, including sexual abuse, rotten food, forced labor, and in some cases even murder happening inside the detention facilities. So the conditions inside the detention facilities are horrible, even in the ones that are inside the United States. And I can bring a phrase that it still haunts me, that one person that was in detention inside the Elizabeth detention facility in New Jersey, he was telling that the detention center was the place where dreams turns into dust. And that's what most of these detention facilities represent for communities. Just a dream just falling down and trip apart by the mistreatments that they get inside the detention facilities. We can go to the next one. This is just for 2023. The revenue for Geo Group, for instance, for immigration detention was 47.5%. For last year, it was 60%. We still don't have the data for 2025, but they just got an agreement for 15 years more for a new detention facility. The Delaney Hall in New Jersey, that will be the first detention facility opened with the Trump administration. We can go to the next one. And this facility, the one that I'm talking about, the Delaney Hall, is estimated for $1 billion, and it will be a 1,000-bed facility. It's a private business. It doesn't even have the permissions acquired, but they already have the contract, and they are already conducting discussions around how this detention facility will work. And it's also really interesting that we have been trying to get access to through a FOIA request to the contract, and we are still waiting on that because they don't want to give access to the organizations, to the information that has been exchanged. We can go to the next one. The problem is huge inside the country, but we also have the problem outside the country. And we have detention facilities, not only in El Salvador, as we saw over the weekend, but we also have been hearing about Guantanamo in Cuba. But we have also in Costa Rica and in Panama that hasn't been that public about. So we have those detention facilities. I'll go one by one if you show me the. So the Guantanamo has been heard before. It was established for events and acts of terrorism, or so-called acts of terrorism for 9/11. And it was established outside the U.S. to circumvent legal protections of people. They have conducted efforts. They have sent people inside Guantanamo. They have to bring them back. But right now, they are looking for options to bring more people inside Guantanamo. One of the things that happened is that there is a system that you can track people that it's being detained. And we have a lot of people that they are shown that they are in one detention facility, but they are not there. And we cannot find where they are.
Araceli, I hate to interrupt, but if you could wrap it up in about 2 minutes so we can kind of save time for other speakers and the Q&A.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Next one, Costa Rica has only a temporary migrant care center, but they are then deported to other places. We can go to the next one, and that will be Panama. That's a detention facility that is serving both holding area for deportees and transit point. And then the last one, we have El Salvador that we saw over the weekend. And then in El Salvador, they are being detained in the terrorist confinement center, which is one of the most horrible detention facilities and jails in El Salvador. And that's saying a lot because El Salvador detention is horrible. As a Salvadorian, I can provide more information about this, but there is a lot of human rights concerns inside that facility. And then we can go to this, and this is when the judge order came, and this is the president of El Salvador, and how he's mocking about the decisions and the court, which is really concerning because his reaction was like, oopsie, too late, and laughing about the decisions that the courts are putting, meaning that there is no respect for what is the law and order in this country and what people needs to wants to believe that will protect us. And then the next one, it's only some testimonies of people and how they have felt inside the detention facilities. And that will be it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Araceli. You know, it's it's damning, it's painful, but thank you for sharing, and I hope people absorbed it, with all of its human implications, and will be moved to take action. Itzel, you are next up.
Yeah, same PowerPoint slide, Mariana, please. That's just gonna be right afterwards. So we wanted to take a moment. I know there's a lot of information that Araceli provided. As Joseph stated earlier, my name is Itzel Hernandez. I am the immigrant rights organizer based out of our Central Jersey office area. And what I hope to do is to at least be able to place a couple of things into context, but really provide an overview of where we are in this moment. So we can go to the next slide. I'll start off by saying that I have to do presentations on Know Your Rights for organizations. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been able to train over 300 organizations on their rights. And one of the slides that we constantly have to update is one that looks a little similar to this, which has that big number, right? 193 executive orders have been issued on immigration. And I really want folks to think about anything changing in your job or your field or in your hobby. Like if there was, even if it's like a game that you play and suddenly in the span of 57 days, there's 193 changes to it. It is an overwhelming amount of data to understand, to dissect, and of course, to make sense out of, right? So I just really want folks to think about that on a daily basis. Myself, Araceli, Alexander, and anyone else that works in immigration, we are tasked with understanding 3 executive orders a day and understanding what each of those means. And as you can imagine, anything that is built or based upon the incredibly complex, archaic, and honestly contradicting at times immigration laws in the United States makes it even more time consuming for us to be able to understand these things. But I want to highlight a couple of things, especially the one at the very top. Prior to the Trump administration, for a long, long time, it's been a long-standing courtesy. And I think that that framing actually helps me personally understand how much of our society as a whole is based upon trust. People in power, and we trust them that they're going to do the right thing, and we trust them that they're going to abide by our laws. And I think what we are witnessing happening right now is what happens when maybe we trust a little too much, or when we trust that things don't have to get fixed because they haven't been broken yet, or things haven't been exploited. But the first one, for a long, long time, for over a decade, there's been an executive memo, which is nothing more than a suggestion at the federal level that said that Immigration Customs Enforcement, or ICE, was discouraged, and that's the wording that it had, from being able to carry out enforcement in places like churches, schools, hospitals. It's never been banned or not a place where they can carry out enforcement. And that says a lot about our civil society. But one of the things that I personally use as a barometer to figure out how intense the administration was going to go after the norm, because that's really what we were hoping to keep to some degree, was the end of that sensitive location memo. On day one, we immediately had those protections removed. And I knew from that moment that it was going to be a race all around for the next 4 years. And so that's one of the reasons why we started training folks so early on, to make sure that now it's not just individuals, people who may be directly impacted, who are at risk of deportation, or who might be deported. It is anyone and everyone in US civil society really that has to know their rights. And I also want to talk about the fact that what we have come down to, and this is a point I'll touch on a little bit at the end, is really constitutional rights. And that's also something to keep in mind, in how in 57 days we have gone from some significant protections to a lot of Know Your Rights presentations. Designated English as an official language. These are a lot of executive orders that oftentimes feel like rhetoric, but they have real impact. This makes it harder for folks that are non-English speakers to be able to access different types of help from the federal government. I'll just note, and this is one of the things that I think Alexander will kind of talk about, is that this is the reason why states having their own autonomy really does matter and plays a huge role in our ability to push back against the federal government attacks. The expansion of private prisons, like Araceli mentioned. And then another one to really keep an eye on is the deputization of federal agencies or agents for immigration enforcement. It used to be that Immigration Customs Enforcement, or ICE, was one of the main agencies tasked with carrying out enforcement. But now we have the DEA, or the ATF, the FBI, and a number of other agencies, and potentially the IRS. And I also just want to talk about how important it is for us to realize that this is basically the cost of racism. All these policies are being enacted at an incredibly high, both like moral cost, but also just purely in the financial sense. Targeting people that are taxpayers it's a very interesting way of trying to weaponize people's willingness to be part of a system. And that's, I think, one of the other things about trust, right? People trusted the federal government in many different ways, including myself as a DACA recipient, by handing over my information to them 12 years ago. And, we're in a different situation now. The funding freeze of NGOs, I want to talk about this point specifically because if you've seen in the news, there was a lot and still is a lot of issues with the way that the executive branch went ahead and froze the funding of many, many, many NGOs and nonprofits. But the one thing I want to talk about, and this is why I mention it here, is because I want folks to really pay attention to what happens when if the money comes back. Because one of the things that we are likely to see is the criminalization of both agencies and people, including everyday citizens, who are willing to continue to serve their immigrant neighbors regardless of immigration status. And so one thing to keep in mind is when the funding comes back, if the funding comes back from the federal government to some of these NGOs, will they allow that money to be used for undocumented people? Because among all the things that we are seeing, there's this very intentional, if you just focus enough, push to actually criminalize anyone that wants to help and aid people who are undocumented. And that's one more of the layers of dehumanization. You can help others, but not these folks. And I think it goes back to why the title of the webinar is so accurate. And then courthouse protocol, an elimination of victim center approach. Again, in the flurry of different things, one of the things that got lost is that it is now allowed, and in the state of New Jersey specifically, and I'm sure it would be the case for other states, there are now memos that have gone out to courts, all courts in general that are state courts, letting them know that if immigration enforcement is carried out, they're simply to step aside, even if it's someone who is there to serve as a witness or a victim themselves. And again, I think this just violates the norm of everyday civil society. We can go on to the next slide. Registry is the other one for folks to keep in mind. Starting on April 11, the plan for the federal government is to get undocumented immigrants to register with the U.S. government or be willing to risk facing both criminal charges or detention and deportation. I think, again, the details here and whether this takes effect or it gets challenged in the courts undoubtedly will. But it's really important for us to start paying attention to the way in which we are starting to create a brand new reality, not just for immigrants. And that's really, I think, the overall tone of this conversation. I really want someone to explain to me what the process of a person who is supposed to be enforcing this will use in order for them to know why one particular person is not likely to be a U.S. citizen and another particular person is likely to be a U.S. citizen or does not need to have proof of registration. In the state of New Jersey, used to give you context, 1 out of 4 individuals are an immigrant. And so where and how exactly will we make sure that the right people carry papers on them at all times? Failure to provide paperwork or carry paperwork on you will, of course, could actually bring you into criminal charges. Like we mentioned, I believe the fine is about $5,000 and then up to 6 months in jail. But the other thing that's really interesting is that it's for anyone over the age of 14. And if you are not 14, you are still expected to have a parent or a guardian register you. And then from the time you turn 14, you would go and give your fingerprints over to the federal government. This is intentional, as I've said. The entire point of the registry, according to the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, is to compel mass self-deportation. And so what was once used as an app to try to get an appointment with an asylum officer, the CBP-1 app, is now being used for people to self-report and, in theory, let the government know if they have self-deported. The other thing to really think about is, again, going back to the financial investment. There was a 200 million anti-immigrant ad campaign that the administration has paid for because the point is to scare people. The point is to dehumanize folks. We can go to the next slide. Activists. This is, I think, one of the things that folks have been mentioning earlier, and it's very, very important. Activists are actively in the United States being surveilled, targeted, detained, and deported. The case of Mahmoud Khalil, I think, is one of the ones that definitely sent shivers down the spine of every American who understands the importance of freedom of speech. And then, unfortunately, earlier this morning, at least I saw it, Jeanette, who is a longtime immigrant rights activist out of Colorado, was also detained. This is one of the campaigns that AFSC used to run even back in, I think it's 2009, when she was very well known because she spent some time taking sanctuary in a church. And unfortunately, even though there was no proper paperwork, she was detained earlier this week. And again, there is, unlike the Mahmoud Khalil conversation where a lot of folks talk about his activism around Gaza, Jenna did have an outstanding deportation order that, again, she's been actively fighting for a long, long time. But it seems to be that this might be one of the first cases in this new administration where someone's been particularly targeted because of their immigration activism. And so again, that umbrella of who is opposed to the federal government's interest is starting to get wider and wider, and it's a terrifying prospect to think where it will end. Next slide.
No, I hate to do it again, but a couple minutes.
Nope, this is my last one.
Okay.
So where we are heading to is a constitutional crisis, folks. The ACLU said as much this morning that we are at a place where we are paying close attention to whether or not the administration is willing to abide by court rulings. Because as it was explained by Araceli earlier, even though the court ordered those planes to be brought back to the US, and even though the court issued an order 12 minutes before the last plane got sent out, we are not having a conversation about what will happen if the administration continues to defy court orders. And really what it will come down to is whether the judicial branch decides to challenge the power of the executive branch, or if it will simply bend the knee. And I hope for all of our well-beings collectively, not just here in the United States, but all around, that the things that held democracy together can withstand this storm. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Itzel. I mean, the risk here, or vulnerable here, is whether or not we truly become a dictatorship. If the court orders aren't followed, we have a government with that's classically a dictatorship. I want to ask, if you can, while Alexandra is speaking, if you could shoot over to Mariana the link for the Guardian article, which includes the report that Mohammed Khalil sent out from his prison in Louisiana. I think people should read that and see it. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Alexandra. Look forward to hearing your talk.
Wonderful. It is good to be here tonight. I'm an organizer. I know many of you are also organizers. And organizers talk about power. So that's what I'm going to do today. Next slide. So one of the many ways you can think about power is through the framework that was developed by John Gaventa, an organizer in Appalachia. And he thinks of power in 3 levels. The first level is who wins and who loses in a game, any contest, for example, an election. Someone wins, someone loses. Second dimension of power are the rules of the game that will dictate who wins and who loses. So in the election example, it will be gerrymandering. It can be voter suppression laws. We could talk about the Electoral College, etc. And then the third dimension of power are the narratives a society holds, the discourses that it believes in that justifies who wins and who loses, that justifies the first dimension. So, for example, the American dream, the Statue of Liberty, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're not making it in the United States, it's your own damn fault, because this is the land of opportunity. So those, the third dimension justifies. So, for example, in the second dimension, I have friends, organizers in Georgia who told me that in Western Georgia, some counties made laws that prohibited buses from going within 10 miles of a voting booth. So that is a second dimension policy that will dictate who wins and who loses. The third dimension is a idea that justifies the fact that people can't vote in Western, at least poor people can't vote in Western Georgia. In the election example, I would suggest that the myth or the discourse is that the United States is a democracy. Not only are we a democracy, we're the best democracy in the world. We're so good at democracy, we send observers to other countries to observe their democracies because that's how good we are. And so that fiction, that myth that the United States is a democracy justifies all of the, maybe we could say irregularities, but really injustices in our system. So I want to talk today and give you examples of first dimension, second dimension, and third dimension resistance for immigrant justice. Next. So first I'm going to talk about first dimension. And these are all examples that we accomplished during Trump's first presidency. So this is ICE headquarters in Massachusetts. And here we stopped a deportation of this particular person, Blanca. And we worked on many deportation defense cases. We also got people out of detention. So that is something we're doing right now, right? Many groups across the country are working on this. We are developing many places, including in our area. We're developing ICE Watch, a neighborhood watch to keep tabs on ICE vehicles. We're also having hotlines. There's many ways we are doing first dimension work. Super important. Next slide. But back to the theory, right? The second dimension is really important. So next slide. These are some examples of second dimension. During Trump's first presidency, we, yeah, there you go. Thank you. We established sanctuary policies in 5 cities in Essex County, which is where we work. It's really important right now to put a wedge between law enforcement and ICE, because ICE at this point cannot do all the work itself. And as Itzel said, both at the state level, but also at the municipal level, we have to create those wedges. And that is something every community can do, is to work with the mayor and the police chief so that they are not calling ICE. And hopefully they're informing you when ICE comes, because they always know when ICE is going to come to town. Next. We also held back ICE at the, they also need beds. In Massachusetts, we don't have for-profit beds, but it is a common thing, as Araceli pointed out so powerfully. We got 2 different sheriffs in our county not to sign agreements with ICE to hold and provide beds for ICE. So it's super important at the county level. Next. In Massachusetts, we have 3 legislations: Dignity Not Deportations, the Safe Communities Act, and then another one that's a little more complex. But one of the things that is possible in some states is to pass state level legislation. And here we are testifying at the Massachusetts State House. Next. It happens that the governor of Massachusetts, the previous governor lived within our jurisdiction. And so we were out on across the street. One of the congregations in our organization was across the street from the governor's house. So here we are in front of the governor's house. He was a Republican governor who was refusing to sign the driver's license bill in our state. Again, second dimension work. And then thirdly, the third dimension, next, is, I think right now, one of the most important things that we can do. And I'm not saying this is easy, but it is very important. I want to give you 3 examples that we did during Trump's first presidency. The first is a children's march at the State House in Massachusetts. We had 200 children from very young to high school students. We went throughout the whole State House singing songs, and we ended up next at the governor's office. Here you see the governor's, the door to the governor's office and some guards. The children were followed by clergy. We had about 35 clergy do civil disobedience. They stayed there for hours, so the governor couldn't come in or out. He refused to meet with them, so they just sat down and sang songs and prayed and read from the Bible. But a strong shift in who are immigrants, right? Immigrants are these children. Immigrants are families. We got a lot of press around this. Next. The second case was civil disobedience at ICE headquarters. So we wanted to dramatize the idea that children are being ripped from their mothers. And so we had mothers sit down at the entrance of ICE, and we put our children on our laps. And so if they wanted to arrest us, they would have to take our children off of our laps. Next. And here are the mothers. Oh, one back, please. Yeah, here are the mothers and the children. We sat there for a few hours and blocked traffic into ICE. And we got press in all of the major newspapers and television stations to highlight the fact that that immigrants are not criminals, immigrants are mothers and children, and they're being ripped apart from each other. And then the third example was a funeral we held at Government Center in downtown Boston. It is in front of the JFK Federal Building, where USCIS is. And that year in 2019, 7 children died in detention, at least as of August of that year. 7 children had died in detention. And so we built a child-sized coffin, and we had an interfaith funeral service with Muslim, Jewish, Christian clergy. And then we picked up the coffin and we carried it on our shoulders for 6 days, 76 miles. And we went through many little towns from Boston all the way to Dover, New Hampshire, where a ICE detention center is. And we had press conferences every night in all of the cities and towns we passed to highlight the atrocity and the inhumanity of ICE. Next. And so this is my last slide. I wanted to talk about that third dimension as narrative. It's about narratives and myths. And right now, I think, are called to engage in what Jabari Assim calls narrative combat, right? It's not a time when we can engage in polite work. The Trump administration are masters at narrative combat, and we need to rise to the occasion and imagine powerful symbolic actions that are challenging the narratives. I do think that it is, given everything that's happened just in the last week, there is a role for every group of people, right? I don't think immigrants with vulnerable visas or without visas can engage in narrative combat. Maybe they want to, but there is a role for people with citizenship to engage in narrative combat. And I will end there.
Thank you, Alexandra. My hope is that your talk and the actions that you have described will encourage people who are listening to find ways to engage in actions as well. I think one of the things I want to ask each of you that you can do after the webinar would be to send me links to organizations or actions that people can link up with, so that they can follow on. I want to ask Mariana if you can post the link to the Massachusetts Immigration and Refugees organization, their actions. I want people, at least in the Boston area, to be aware that at the legislative level, there's activities going on at the Massachusetts State House today and tomorrow. And of course, the need for support will be ongoing. So there it is. Mariana has posted the link. That's actually the Guardian article, which reports on Mahmoud Khalil's appeal from and description of the situation in his Louisiana prison, and talks about the meaning of his arrest. I wanted to give each of you a chance either to comment on what others have said or to push back with questions. We got three great people here. Anything that occurred to you that you wanted to push back on or ask about?
I can go first. I thought it was really powerful how Araceli talked about hate narratives, and that narratives hate narratives are violence, are social structural violence. And I think that it is a very important point that what we're seeing is violence, even if it's not like a traditional definition of violence. Then I had a question for maybe for both of you, but Itzel, well, first of all, you said that everybody's constitutional rights are at risk, and I think we need to keep that really at the forefront. But I have a question for both of you about the registry, because lots of immigrants are asking me about the registry. And you're right, Itzel, it may be stopped in the courts temporarily. But I was just wondering what your thoughts on it, because, you know, I've been thinking about, like all of us, about totalitarian regimes in the past. And one of the things that I was reminded of was the way that at the end of World War II, most Jews in Poland had perished, had died, had been killed. But in Denmark, most Jews were saved because the Danish people, most of the Danish people put yellow stars on their jackets, right? And they said, no, we're going to stand in solidarity. And so I was thinking, you know, like maybe if it comes to be, maybe we all register, or like, I don't know what what the response would be, but maybe we all register, or maybe we encourage people not to register. Like, I don't know, but like, what does resistance look like? Anyway, it's a question in my mind.
I can start. I think resistance looks different depending on where you are. I think that there's a lot of places where resistance could look like starting to imagine, as hard as it is in this moment, I feel at least, sometimes, to really imagine what welcoming the stranger looks like. As somebody that's been doing immigration for close to 7 years, 8 years, I think I am struck often by how many of the conversations that we are having right now I've been having for a long time. So one of the main reasons why the office was placed where it was placed was because there's a desert of both legal services, but then also conversation in the counties that we currently service, at least out of my office. Because there are populations where the majority of the people are not foreign born, right? And I think for me, resistance looks so different in New Jersey in this moment, and solidarity can look different because of that than it will look like in a place like Arizona and Mississippi, and places where they were so quick to immediately, places like Florida, right, where they created a special legislative session just so the entire legislative body of Florida could come together to say, we want to subscribe to every single thing that the federal government says we should do to our neighbors, willingly, like sign us up right now, versus other states that pushed back and said, not here. In New Jersey, what registry looks like, I actually think that we are perfectly placed to try to answer that question for the rest of the country in, or at least in this region, in heavily diverse areas. We are the fourth most diverse state in the country, right? How do you point out the other when it is 25% of the folks, at least foreign born, right? And what does the other look like? Who is the other? One of the overarching questions that I have oftentimes when I have this conversation with people is, how would you know? What would give it away? And I think therein lies the danger, and there also kicks a factor of like almost self-survival, right? Because if you are a US citizen, but you may have been a descendant from, what does that look like? And I think this question applies to everybody, including the folks that are supposed to be carrying out that enforcement. What does enforcement look like in this moment? And what am I willing to comply with? Nothing works without complicity. And I think that's the real thing that people have to take away from it. We are being asked to be complicit. We're being asked to sanction all this behavior. One of my favorite things to remind people is that the justification for all things we carry out, both domestically and abroad, is in the name of Americans, citizens. And people have to start taking that personally. If it's not what you believe in, if this is not reflective, and it's hard, of course it's hard to create a place that's reflective of all your values. but you got to try and you got to start somewhere. And I would say that registry, it's a great place to start and say, not while I'm here and not in my name.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and I'll be exploring here in Massachusetts at least what we can do in that regard. Other questions or responses? And we can move to Q&A. I would just say, listening to what Itzel was just saying, I was reminded of a quotation from Howard Zinn, who told us, the problem is not civil disobedience, the problem is obedience.
That's right.
I'm also thinking, I made reference to my Jewish identity as we began. Passover is coming, and in the Passover Seder, we make room and we open the door for Elijah, the stranger, to be welcomed in, and that's certainly obviously not what Israel is doing at the moment, but it's I think it's an important value that we need to bear in mind. So I'm going to go to Q&A. I'm a little bit awkward with the system, but there's a question here. Can you put the name of the woman who was deported for immigrant activism into the chat? Well, we don't really have a chat here, so could you remind us the name of the woman?
Yes, so I actually sent the message to Mariana, and it does have the link there. It's there's two things that you'll see once the links are sent out or shared. One is going to be an article with a little bit of a background for her story, and then the second one is actually one of the petitions that AFSC has for Jeanette Vizquerra. So JeANETTE, and then V as in Victor, IZGUERRA. And that petition, has a phone script to call. And again, when we talk about people power, when we talk about what Alexander was sharing with us, it really does come down to people power now. It comes down to being willing to make that phone call and say, I'm not just going to let it happen silently. It comes out to going in the streets and protesting, because you still have the right to assemble and do that. I think it's a moment where people have to be proud to exercise their constitutional rights. And make them mean something. The Constitution doesn't mean anything if we don't exercise those rights.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Great.
add to that. Itzel, when you were talking, one of the things I remembered was the work of a genocide scholar by the name of Dr. Stephen Ray. And he talks about three things that are necessary in a pre-genocidal moment. So before genocide happens, he studies like what are the conditions before genocide happens. And he states there's three things. First, a group of people are demonized over time, right? And we've seen that. Second is plans, a registry, plans are made to eliminate the people, to push the people out of the country. And third, a registry is created so that those plans can be executed. And so so I think, according to Dr. Stephen Ray, this is a pre-genocidal moment.
And I'll add one more thing, Joseph, sorry, because this is one of my favorite stats to name out. You would think, as we are laying out these massive numbers, billions of dollars. I mean, you got billions here, millions there, as if the streets didn't need any any infrastructure investment, our healthcare system, our educational system. I just really want to remind folks that the entire apparatus of the surveillance states in the United States has turned on a dime. Over 3% of the population, folks. Undocumented immigrants only amount to 3% of the population in the entire United States. And so when you start to think about that, you really start to think whether all these societal things that we have, all the issues, the deep-rooted, centuries-old issues in this country, really are happening because 3% of people became our neighbors.
Well, I'll just jump in and say, it's quite clear that the Trump MAGA government, seeks basically to overturn so much of the progressive legislation, not only not only since the 1965 Civil Rights Act, but since the end of the Civil War. And it's clear both within the country and internationally, they're looking to create a white supremacist order. And you know, the attack on immigrants is a major part of that, cutting edge, but it applies obviously to all people of color in this country. And then there's the question in terms of you know, those of us who are white gringos, you know, we're caught up in that as well. And the question comes, you know, which side are you on? The question here from Mark Ginsburg, has the New Jersey governor or legislature, or those in other states, taken positions against the location of detention facilities in their jurisdiction?
Yes, in New Jersey they have. However, it's not the same like publicly saying that we don't want the detention facilities as they have done. However, we still have a bill in process that it's called the Immigrant Trust Act that is in the legislature, and we are still trying to get them to sign the bill to protect immigrant communities. And there haven't been much of the disposition to help out with this. So there is a line that needs to be crossed from the speech to the action and actually protecting the communities.
Okay, over 90% of Guantanamo detainees were held without charge, part of the manufactured war on terror. So I guess to understand the relationship of where we've been and where we are now, and it's all interrelated. Any of you want to comment on that?
Yes, and it comes again with a narrative that is actually creating the idea that there is a reason for this to happen when it's only aimed to do harm and it's based on racism. And that's what happening now. That's what happened before. That's my point on it.
And I'll just say that it's really important for us to really pay attention to the parallels between many of the things that we're seeing the government carry out right now, like similar to a registry, are things that happened after the attacks in the US over 9/11, right? The Department of Homeland Security and the way that we started to view immigration just really turned the minute that that event happened. And I think it's really important for folks to understand why it's different. This is a different moment for activism. It's a different moment for people to do advocacy. It's a different moment for anyone that carries out social justice in the United States, in part because even though it's not new, it is a lot more blatant and also a lot less regulated. The way in which they're targeting activists, which I think really matters. There's a particular another link that I can share that can then be shared in the chat about the software that's being used. Something that would take months for agencies to be able to get information on someone now takes 15 minutes. And if you think what websites that they're even monitoring in order for people to know anything from dating apps to your Amazon purchases, I mean, everything in order for them to be able to map out networks. And so, again, it's not the first time. All those things that were never taken care of. The registry, the Alien Enemy Act, that could have been removed. That was a shameful part of our history. And that's the other part to really think about, right? There's a moment of accountability here for the people that have sat in those places of power that never took the time to just wipe away some of those things that could be exploited. Again, this could have happened under any administration, folks. These are executive orders, right? The Biden administration just ended the highest amount of deportation, both in percentage and in numbers. It's not a new phenomenon. It's just that we're finally seeing it out in the open. And unfortunately, it's really ugly, which is exactly what we've been warning people for years and decades.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, they're executing the 1996 Clinton Immigration Act, right? So these laws were created by a Democratic administration.
Yes. A question here from Maureen Lennon, I think for Alexandra, basically about the function and possibility of talking about attractive alternatives in the narrative combat mode. How important are putting together or putting forward more positive alternatives in the narrative competition.
Positive alternatives. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, like the examples I gave were to create powerful visual examples of the humanity of the human beings that we're talking about. In this case, as Itzel calls them, our neighbors, right? Their humanity, right? Their motherhood, their childhood. So to me, that's really positive. So one of the things that I think is really important is to be working across, like, I'm a policy person. So I like to have artists in my midst because there's a lot of power in visuals, and also poets, singers, right? We need narrative, those and also clergy, because the currency of clergy is narrative. So so are people in communications. So like the skills of narrative combat are developed. I mean, anybody can have them, but they're developed in certain types of professions or skills, and so when I was a director of ECHO, like tried to recruit and organize those in the arts, because their ideas were very powerful. So I'm not sure if I've answered the question, but
So just to say that, I go back to the civil rights movement and remembering from Dr. King and others, a major part of the strategy was to organize a kind of very public social engagement or event that illuminates reality that people prefer not to see. And in a sense, and you go back to Gandhi as well, in terms of shaming the oppressor, or in this case, people complicit with the oppressor to change policy and to act. So we have a long tradition of that. There's a question here probably for me from Lenny Reeves, unable to copy the links from the chat. Is a new Zoom workplace a problem, or my computer? I'll simply say that what we'll do, and there's another question from Pam Thomas Hill, wanting information via email to the attendees. I will, in the next few days, I can't do it tomorrow, go through the webinar and the links that you provide to me, and you basically create a list or a post that I can share with people who've registered and otherwise. So that will come. Maybe a question of history. I don't know that that we'll have this here. Someone read that Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman used the Alien Enemy Act after both the world wars had ended. I mean, we know they were active during the wars. Is that anything we know about, or let that historical detail pass? We'll let that historical detail pass. And I think Jeffrey Bartle has put in quite a number of questions here. Here's from George Friday. Let me see if I can find it here. On. Not seeing it.
I can see if you want me to read it.
Okay, if you could.
Yep. It says, do you think this incites more overt racism and potential violence on other BIPOC communities? That's what is poised to happen in the South and Deep South. I can get it started. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes it, we've seen it already, right? That students don't feel safe being in school. There was a tragic case of that young girl who decided to commit suicide because she was being bullied about her parents' immigration status. I work with young people and I worry deeply about their mental well-being and their emotional well-being, as well as their physical well-being. There's no age for detention. And with registry being 14 and over, I can never really think of a time where I would have to sit down and break those news to someone that young, or a parent to register a child. But undoubtedly, I think we've seen a lot more attacks, people who feel less comfortable speaking whatever language they are hoping to speak publicly and openly. But I also think, again, this is a place where, bystander intervention really matters, right? That's the everyday way for you to show solidarity, to be able to say that's not okay. As Joseph was sharing earlier, it's about shaming that behavior. If we don't want that behavior to be played out publicly, we hold the line. We hold that line every day.
So from Jeffrey Barkdale, kind of something to encourage people who are on the webinar to think about in terms of finding ways to work with Pastor Niemöller's poem, transforming it into something that speaks to our immediate reality. I think that takes us. This is George Friday's question. The racists who advertised have videos extolling racist stuff. We could steal the format with Quaker stuff. I guess simply to say that from any denomination, there are traditions and values and testimonies in terms of justice and dignity for all people. And just to say that this could be done by anyone. I'm not seeing other questions here. I want to appreciate the I want to say the heartfelt, heart rendering reflections and information you've provided us, and the inspiration. And my hope is that this was not done as an academic exercise, friends. This was done as a way to, if you will, promote actions for solidarity and beyond solidarity in terms of protecting people and working for policy changes. So we'll be following up on this. And I just want to thank each of our speakers for making the time to be with us tonight and for all of the work that you do day to day, which I know has to be very, if you look at soul work, I mean, just growing out of recognition of pain and actions of love. And so I just want to appreciate that as we end, and I want to wish everybody here safety. This might be something that is monitored as well, and encouraged. So let's go forward in a dark time and do all that we can. Thank you so much.